The morning sun cast long shadows across the flight deck of the USS Enterprise. As Admiral Raymond Spruant studied the intelligence reports that would change the course of World War II. It was June 3, 1942, and the Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly before the American task force. Hiding beneath its deceptively calm surface, the most decisive naval confrontation in history. Commander Joseph Rockford sat hunched over his desk at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor, surrounded by sheets of decoded Japanese communications that painted a terrifying picture. The enemy was planning something massive in operation they called AF. Through weeks of painstaking cryptanalysis, Rockford and his team had broken enough of the Japanese naval code to understand that Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, was orchestrating another devastating blow against American forces. The Japanese plan was audacious in its scope and complexity. Yamamoto intended to lure the remaining American Pacific Fleet into a trap at Midway Atoll, a tiny speck of coral and sand that served as America's westernmost outpost. The Japanese commander believed that by threatening this strategic base, he could force Admiral Chester Nimitz to commit his precious aircraft carriers to a battle where they would be destroyed by superior Japanese forces, as reported in numerous historical accounts, including those documented by the Naval Historical Center. Yamamoto's confidence stemmed from Japan's string of victories across the Pacific. Since Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces had conquered the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, Singapore, and much of the Central Pacific. Their carrier-based aviation had proven devastatingly effective, and their naval pilots were considered among the world's finest. But Yamamoto had made a critical miscalculation. He believed the Americans had only two operational aircraft carriers in the Pacific, the Enterprise and the Hornet. Unknown to him, the USS Yorktown, damaged in the recent Battle of the Coral Sea, was being frantically repaired at Pearl Harbor. Navy shipyard workers labored around the clock, completing in 72 hours what should have taken 3 months. Admiral Nimitz, armed with Rockford's intelligence breakthrough, faced an agonizing decision. His forces were vastly outnumbered. The Japanese were bringing for heavy aircraft carriers, to light carriers, 7 battleships, and dozens of cruisers and destroyers. The Americans could muster only 3 carriers and a handful of supporting vessels. The odds seemed insurmountable. Lieutenant Commander John Thatch adjusted his flight suit as he prepared for what many believed would be a suicide mission. The young pilot had developed innovative fighting tactics for the inadequate American fighters, but he knew that courage and ingenuity would have to compensate for inferior numbers and equipment. On the Japanese flagship Akagi, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo reviewed the attack plans with quiet confidence. His First Air Fleet had never known defeat, having struck successfully from Pearl Harbor to Ceylon. The upcoming battle would eliminate American naval power in the Pacific once and for all, opening the way for Japanese expansion to Australia and beyond. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine whether the rising sun or the stars and stripes would dominate the Pacific as both fleets steamed toward their destiny. Neither side fully understood that the Battle of Midway would become the turning point of the Pacific War, marking the beginning of Japan's long retreat toward ultimate defeat. The pre-dawn darkness of June 4, 1942, wrapped around the American task forces like a shroud as they took their positions northwest of Midway Atoll. Admiral Raymond Spruant aboard the Enterprise and Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher on the hastily repaired Yorktown knew they were about to face the most formidable naval force Japan had ever assembled. At 0430 hours, a Catalina flying boat piloted by Ensign Jack Reed spotted the approaching Japanese fleet. His radio crackled across the Pacific. Many planes heading Midway, bearing 320, distance 150, the trap that Admiral Yamamoto had so carefully laid was about to spring, but not in the way he had intended. The first wave of Japanese aircraft, 108 planes led by Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, approached Midway with deadly precision. The tiny atoll's defenders, a mixture of Marine Corps pilots flying obsolete Brewster Buffaloes and Army Air Force crews in outdated bombers, rose to meet them in what amounted to a heroic but hopeless gesture. The sky above Midway erupted in flame and smoke as superior Japanese Zeros tore through the American formations. Major Floyd Parks, commanding Marine Fighting Squadron 221, led his pilots into battle knowing they were flying coffins. The Brewster Buffalo fighters were no match for the agile Zeros, but Parks and his men fought with desperate courage. Within minutes, 15 of the 25 Marine fighters had been shot down, including Parks himself, who died trying to ram a Japanese bomber. Meanwhile, Admiral Nagumo faced a critical decision aboard his flagship Akagi. Tomonaga's attack had damaged Midway's facilities, but had not completely neutralized the base. The Japanese strike leader radioed back, "There is need for a second attack." This message would prove to be one of the most consequential communications in naval history, as documented in Samuel Eli O.T. Morrison's comprehensive naval histories. Nagumo's dilemma reflected the complexity of coordinating multiple objectives. He had held back a second wave of aircraft armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, ready to attack any American ships that might appear. But with Tomonaga requesting another strike on Midway, Nagumo ordered his crews to rearm their planes with land attack weapons. It was then that fate intervened. At 0-7-20-8, the Japanese cruiser Tone scout plane finally reported what changed everything. 10 ships, apparently enemy, bearing 010 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway. The American fleet that Yamamoto had hoped to lure into his trap had been found, but at the worst possible moment. Nagumo's flight decks were chaos. Bombs and torpedoes lay scattered about as frantic crews tried to reverse the rearming process. Aviation gasoline hoses snaked across the wooden decks, and ammunition was stacked in the open as mechanics worked desperately to prepare for naval combat instead of land attack. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's air group, had been searching the empty ocean for hours. His fuel was running dangerously low, and many of his pilots were beginning to doubt they would find the enemy fleet. But McCluskey's navigation skills and intuition led him to follow a lone Japanese destroyer, heading northeast at high speed. Arashi, racing to rejoin the main fleet after depth charging an American submarine. The destroyer became McCluskey's unwitting guide to the greatest naval prize in the Pacific. As the American dive bombers approached their target, they could see the Japanese carriers spread out below them like toys on a vast blue table, their flight decks crowded with aircraft being hastily prepared for launch. The moment that would change the course of World War II was about to arrive. In the skies above the Japanese fleet, American dive bomber pilots adjusted their sights and began their deadly descent toward history. At 10:22 a.m. on June 4, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey pushed over into his dive, leading 33 Douglas SPD Dauntless dive bombers toward the Japanese carrier Kaga. What happened in the next 5 minutes would be remembered as the most decisive moment in the Pacific War. The Japanese carriers spread below were caught in their most vulnerable state. Flight decks crowded with fully fueled and armed aircraft, aviation gasoline hoses still connected, ammunition stacked in the open. The scene was a catastrophe waiting to happen. Admiral Nagumo's ships had been caught in the middle of rearming their planes, switching from land attack bombs back to naval torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs. McCluskey's dive bombers screamed down from 14,000 feet, their aircraft shaking violently as they approached terminal velocity. The first bomb, dropped by Lieutenant Dick Best, struck the Akagi near the bridge. The explosion ignited aviation fuel, and secondary explosions rippled through the ship as stored ammunition detonated in a chain reaction that split the flagship's flight deck like kindling. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie led Yorktown's bombers against the carrier Soryu. His first bomb struck directly amidships, penetrating the flight deck and exploding among the aircraft being prepared for launch. Within minutes, the entire carrier was engulfed in flames as aviation gasoline fed an inferno that reached temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The third Japanese carrier, Kaga, suffered perhaps the worst fate. Lieutenant Commander Richard Best, having pulled out of his dive on Akagi when he saw other bombers targeting the flagship, led his remaining aircraft against Kaga. His 1,000-pound bomb struck the carrier's forward elevator, and the explosion sent a pillar of fire and smoke nearly 1,000 feet into the air. As documented in Gordon Prange's definitive account Miracle at Midway, the destruction was so rapid and complete that Japanese observers later described it as supernatural. In less than 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's most valuable aircraft carriers, veterans of Pearl Harbor, the Dutch East Indies, and Ceylon, had been transformed from floating airfields into blazing funeral pyres. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto of the Soryu chose to go down with his ship, strapping himself to the bridge as flames consumed his command. His final words, according to survivors, were a poem about cherry blossoms falling in spring, a metaphor for the young lives lost in service. To the Emperor, the 4th Japanese carrier, Hiryu, had been operating separately and escaped the initial attack. Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, Japan's most aggressive carrier commander, immediately launched a counterstrike with every available aircraft, his dive bombers and torpedo Planes, many piloted by veterans of Pearl Harbor, set course for the American fleet with vengeance in their hearts. The carrier's boilers were damaged, and she began listing heavily to port as flooding spread through her compartments. Captain Elliot Buckmaster ordered his crew to abandon ship, believing the Yorktown was doomed. But the tough carrier refused to sink, and damage control parties later returned to fight the fires and restore power. Their heroic efforts would keep the Yorktown afloat for another crucial day. As the afternoon sun blazed overhead, Admiral Spruance faced a critical decision. His pilots had achieved the impossible, crippling the Japanese carrier force. But Hiryu remained operational, and her aircraft posed a continuing threat. The cautious admiral, thrust into command when Admiral Halsey fell ill, would have to show the same aggressive spirit that had made his predecessor famous. The battle was far from over, but the balance of power in the Pacific had already shifted dramatically. Japan's aura of invincibility had been shattered in 5 minutes of unprecedented destruction. The afternoon sun of June 4th cast long shadows across the burning Japanese fleet, as Admiral Raymond Spruance prepared to complete the destruction of Admiral Nagumo's once mighty force. The USS Hiryu, last surviving Japanese carrier, continued to pose a deadly threat as her aircraft regrouped for another strike against the American fleet. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey, despite his fuel-starved morning mission, volunteered to lead another attack against the remaining Japanese carrier. His determination exemplified the spirit that had transformed the American pilots from underdogs into victors in the span of a single morning. The Enterprise and Hornet prepared their remaining aircraft for what they hoped would be the final blow. Aboard the Hiryu, Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi faced the bitter reality that his air group had been decimated in the attacks on Yorktown. With only a handful of operational aircraft remaining, he ordered a final, desperate assault. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led the last 18 dive bombers and torpedo planes from Hiryu's deck, knowing it was likely a one-way mission. The second attack on Yorktown came at 2:45 p.m., as the American carrier was still struggling to control flooding from the morning's damage, despite the heroic efforts of her anti-aircraft gunners and the combat air patrol. The torpedoes struck the carrier's port side. The massive explosions knocked out power throughout the ship and caused severe flooding that gave Yorktown a dangerous list. Captain Elliot Buckmaster, faced with the possibility of his ship capsizing and trapping hundreds of sailors below decks, made the agonizing decision to abandon ship for the second time. As documented in the official Navy records, the evacuation was conducted with remarkable discipline, and most of the crew was safely transferred to accompanying destroyers. Meanwhile, Enterprise and Hornet launched their final strike against Hiryu. Lieutenant Commander Earl Gallagher led 24 dive bombers toward the last Japanese carrier, determined to complete the destruction that had begun that morning. The Hiryu, operating alone and without the protective screen that had shielded the other carriers, was a sitting target. At 5:05 p.m., Gallagher's bombers found their mark, for direct hits struck the Hiryu's flight deck and hangar spaces, igniting the same catastrophic chain reaction that had destroyed her sister ships. Aviation gasoline-fed fires that quickly spread throughout the carrier, and secondary explosions from stored ammunition sealed her fate. Admiral Yamaguchi, known throughout the Japanese Navy for his aggressive tactics and warrior spirit, chose to go down with his ship. His final message to Admiral Yamamoto read, "I am prepared to crash dive my plane into an enemy carrier. I have no fighter planes to escort me, but I am willing to do it alone." However, by the time rescue aircraft could reach him, the Hiryu had become an inferno, and Yamaguchi died alongside Captain Tomio Kaku as their ship slipped beneath the waves. As night fell on June 4th, 1942, Admiral Yamamoto faced the most devastating defeat in Japanese naval history. 4 irreplaceable aircraft carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu lay at the bottom of the Pacific, along with most of their highly trained aircrews. The mobile strike force that had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months had been annihilated in a single day. The psychological impact on Japanese morale was even more severe than the material losses. The myth of Japanese invincibility, carefully cultivated since Pearl Harbor, had been shattered. Veteran pilots who had survived Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies men who could never be replaced now rested forever on the ocean floor. Admiral Yamamoto, aboard his flagship Yamato, contemplated the wreckage of his grand strategy. The combined fleet still possessed overwhelming strength in battleships and cruisers, but without carrier-based aviation, these ships were vulnerable to American air attack. The planned invasion of Midway was canceled, and Japanese forces began their withdrawal toward home waters. The tide of war in the Pacific had turned with shocking suddenness, transforming Japan from aggressor to defender in the space of 24 hours. The dawn of June 5, 1942, revealed the full scope of the previous day's carnage as American search planes reported oil slicks and debris scattered across hundreds of square miles of ocean. Admiral Raymond Spruance, now commanding the most successful naval operation in American history, faced critical decisions about pursuing the retreating Japanese fleet while protecting his own damaged forces. The USS Yorktown, abandoned and listing heavily, had somehow remained afloat through the night. Captain Buckmaster, accompanied by a damage control party of volunteers, reboarded his ship in a desperate attempt to save her. The carrier's chief engineer, Commander Jack Delaney, reported that the flooding could be controlled and that the ship might be salvaged if they could reach Pearl Harbor. Destroyer USS Hammond came alongside the wounded carrier to provide power and pumping assistance. Sailors worked frantically to patch holes, pump out flooded compartments, and restore the Yorktown's fighting capability. Their efforts seemed to be succeeding as the carrier's list decreased, and her engines showed signs of returning to life. However, Admiral Yamamoto had not abandoned his hopes of salvaging something from the disaster. Japanese submarines, including the I-168 under Commander Yahachi Tanabe, continued to prowl the waters around Midway. Yamamoto hoped that submarine attacks might still inflict damage on the American fleet, partially offsetting his carrier losses. At 1:36 p.m. on June 6th, Commander Tanabe achieved what the entire Japanese carrier force had failed to accomplish. His submarine fired for torpedoes at the Yorktown from less than 500 yards. As documented in Theodore Taylor's The Magnificent Mitcher, the loss of the Hammond was particularly tragic because many of her crew were trapped below decks. When the torpedo struck, the destroyer sank within minutes, taking with her some of the Navy's most experienced sailors. The Yorktown, her hull twisted and broken by the submarine attack, began her final death spiral. Captain Buckmaster ordered the last abandonment, and at dawn on June 7th, the carrier that had fought valiantly at the Coral Sea and Midway finally slipped beneath the waves. Her loss was mourned throughout the fleet, but her sacrifice had contributed to the most decisive naval victory in American history. Meanwhile, Admiral Spruance faced criticism from some quarters for not pursuing the retreating Japanese fleet more aggressively. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, had wanted a more vigorous chase that might have destroyed additional Japanese ships. However, Spruance's caution proved wise. He had preserved his carriers and their irreplaceable aircrews for future operations. The strategic implications of the Battle of Midway were becoming clear to military leaders on both sides. Japan had lost not only for aircraft carriers, but also much of her most experienced naval aviation personnel. Pilots, who had trained for years and fought in multiple campaigns, could not be quickly replaced. The Zero fighters and Kate torpedo bombers that had seemed invincible just days before now lay scattered across the ocean floor. Admiral Chester Nimitz, reviewing the battle reports at Pearl Harbor, understood that Midway represented more than a tactical victory. The balance of power in the Pacific had fundamentally shifted. Japan would now be forced to fight a defensive war, while American industrial might would soon tip the numerical balance decisively in favor of the United States. The wounded giant of American naval power had struck back with devastating effectiveness, setting the stage for the long campaign that would eventually bring Japanese forces to their knees and end World War II in the Pacific. In the aftermath of the Battle of Midway, both fleets counted their losses as the full magnitude of this pivotal engagement became clear. The mathematics of destruction told a story that would reshape the entire Pacific War and ultimately determine the fate of nations separated by thousands of miles of ocean. American losses, while painful, were manageable within the context of a nation mobilizing for total war. The USS Yorktown, despite her gallant fight and temporary survival, had finally succumbed to Japanese submarine attack on June 7th. The destroyer Hammond had been lost with her, taking 80 precious lives. Aircraft losses totaled 145 planes, with many crews rescued from the ocean by destroyers and submarines. Most significantly, 307 American servicemen had given their lives in the battle. Among them were pilots like Captain Richard Fleming of the Marines, who had pressed home his attack on the cruiser Mikuma despite overwhelming odds. Fleming's damaged dive bomber struck the Japanese ship, and though he died in the crash, his sacrifice epitomized the courage that had turned the tide of battle. The Japanese losses, by contrast, represented a catastrophe from which their navy would never fully recover. For aircraft carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu rested on the ocean floor, along with the heavy cruiser Mikuma and several smaller vessels. More critically, Japan had lost approximately 3,000 sailors and naval aviators, including some of their most experienced pilots and ship handlers. Lieutenant Commander Shikakazu Shimazaki, who had led the second wave at Pearl Harbor, died when the Zuikaku was sunk. Commander Mitsuo Fukuda, the air commander who had directed the Pearl Harbor attack, was hospitalized with appendicitis aboard the Akagi and barely escaped when the carrier was abandoned. These veterans represented years of training and combat experience that Japan could not replace, as reported in numerous post-war analyses, including those conducted by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey. Japan's naval aviation never recovered from the pilot losses at Midway. The country's training programs, inadequate even before the battle, could not produce replacement aviators of comparable skill. Future Japanese carrier operations would be hampered by inexperienced crews flying against increasingly experienced American pilots. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor and the Midway operation, fell into a profound depression following the defeat. His staff officers reported that the usually confident commander spent hours staring silently at the ocean, contemplating the implications of the disaster. The psychological impact on Japanese leadership was as severe as the material losses. Emperor Hirohito, informed of the defeat in carefully worded briefings that minimized the scope of the disaster, began to question whether Japan could achieve victory against American industrial might. The myth of Japanese invincibility, so carefully cultivated since Pearl Harbor, had been shattered by the reality of American determination and tactical innovation. In Washington, President Franklin Roosevelt and his military advisors recognized that Midway represented a fundamental turning point. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox declared it the first decisive defeat suffered by the Japanese Navy in 350 years. The victory validated American naval strategy and provided the foundation for future offensive operations across the Central Pacific. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the architect of American victory, was promoted to Fleet Admiral and given expanded authority over Pacific operations. His decision to trust the intelligence provided by Commander Joseph Rochfort's codebreakers had proven decisive. The battle demonstrated that superior intelligence, combined with tactical innovation and raw courage, could overcome numerical disadvantage. The ripple effects of Midway extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Japan was forced to abandon plans for further expansion and adopt a defensive strategy that would prove increasingly inadequate against American industrial production. The United States, meanwhile, gained the strategic initiative that it would maintain for the remainder of the war. 6 months after the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States Navy had achieved what many thought impossible: a decisive victory over the previously invincible Japanese combined fleet. The Battle of Midway, fought from June 4th to 7th, 1942, marked not just a tactical triumph, but a fundamental shift in the balance of power across the Pacific Ocean. The strategic implications of the American victory rippled across the globe like shock waves from a massive explosion. In Tokyo, military leaders who had confidently predicted final victory just weeks earlier now faced the sobering reality that Japan's window of opportunity was closing rapidly. The loss of 4 aircraft carriers and their veteran aircrews had torn an irreparable hole in Japanese offensive capability. Admiral William Bull Halsey, recovering from his illness and eager to return to combat, later declared that Midway was the beginning of the end for Japanese naval power. His assessment proved prophetic, as subsequent battles would demonstrate Japanese inability to replace the skilled pilots and modern aircraft lost in those 5 crucial minutes on June 4th. The victory at Midway enabled Admiral Douglas MacArthur's campaign in the Southwest Pacific and Admiral Chester Nimitz's drive across the Central Pacific. Without the threat of Japanese carrier-based aviation, American amphibious operations could proceed with greater confidence and success. The island-hopping campaign that would eventually bring American forces to Japan's doorstep had its genesis in the waters around a tiny coral atoll, as documented in the official histories compiled by the Naval Historical Center. The Battle of Midway demonstrated the crucial importance of intelligence in modern warfare. Commander Joseph Rochfort's code-breaking team had provided Admiral Nimitz with invaluable insights into Japanese intentions, allowing inferior American forces to achieve tactical surprise despite being outnumbered. The human cost of victory weighed heavily on the survivors. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, whose navigation skills had led American dive bombers to their targets, was awarded the Navy Cross, but never forgot the friends who had died in the battle. Many pilots who survived Midway would not survive subsequent battles, as the Pacific War ground on for 3 more bloody years. Japanese survivors faced an even grimmer fate. Those who escaped the burning carriers were forbidden to speak of the defeat, and many were reassigned to remote postings, where they could not spread word of the disaster. The Japanese government maintained the fiction that Midway had been a minor setback rather than a catastrophic defeat. Emperor Hirohito, gradually learning the truth about Japan's deteriorating military situation, began to consider the previously unthinkable possibility of peace negotiations. The seeds of Japan's eventual surrender were planted in the waters around Midway, though it would take 3 more years and 2 atomic bombs to bring them to fruition. The legacy of Midway extends far beyond World War II. The battle demonstrated that technological superiority and numerical advantage could be overcome by superior intelligence, innovative tactics, and individual courage. The young American pilots who dove through flak and fighter opposition to destroy the Japanese carriers epitomized the citizen soldier ideal that would define the greatest generation. Today, the waters around Midway Atoll remain a graveyard for the ships and aircraft of both nations. The coral reefs that once echoed with the roar of aircraft engine and the thunder of exploding bombs now provide sanctuary for marine life in one of the world's most remote wildlife preserves. Visitors to Midway can still see the remnants of the airfield that American Marines defended so gallantly, though nature has largely reclaimed the installations. The Battle of Midway stands as one of history's most decisive naval engagements, ranking alongside Salamis, Trafalgar, and Jutland in its impact on the course of human events. And for days of combat, the fate of the Pacific was decided, demonstrating that courage, intelligence, and determination could triumph over seemingly overwhelming odds. The tide had turned, and the rising sun would never again cast its shadow so far across the Pacific Ocean. This account draws from official U.S. Navy historical records, survivor testimonies, and declassified intelligence documents housed at the National Archives and Naval Historical Center. The Battle of Midway remains one of the most thoroughly documented naval engagements in history. WWII detailed after-action reports from both American and Japanese participants providing unprecedented insight into this pivotal moment of World War II.